People like you don't come here for dinner. They come here to take pictures. The words landed in the center of Whitmore's steakhouse like a dropped glass, sharp enough to make nearby conversations fade. For a moment, even the soft jazz drifting through the dining room seemed to disappear. Ethan Brooks stood near the host's stand with his arms folded. A confident smile stretched across his face as he looked Marcus Carter up and down. Marcus didn't react. He simply stood there, calm and still, wearing a black polo shirt, dark jeans and travel-worn sneakers. No expensive watch. No designer jacket. No entourage. Just a man who looked tired after a long day. Around him, the restaurant glowed with warm amber lighting reflecting off polished wood walls and crystal glasses. Aged steak sizzled in the open kitchen. Bottles worth thousands of dollars lined the back wall. It was the kind of place people reserved weeks in advance to experience. And tonight, everyone seemed to be watching. Ethan glanced toward the dining room before speaking louder. "I'm serious, sir. This isn't the place for sightseeing." A few guests exchanged uncomfortable looks. Others lowered their eyes and pretended not to hear. Marcus slowly lifted his gaze toward the waiter. His expression never changed. He had seen this before. Different city, different building, different face. Always the same assumption. Ethan mistook the silence for uncertainty. If you're looking for somewhere more affordable, there are plenty of places a few blocks away. The words carried just far enough for nearby tables to hear. A woman seated near the window paused with her wine glass halfway to her lips. A businessman stopped cutting into his steak. The room wasn't quiet anymore. It was listening. Marcus looked past Ethan toward the dining room. Empty tables sat beneath chandeliers casting golden circles across white tablecloths. He could see them clearly. So could everyone else. Yet Ethan remained planted in front of him like a gatekeeper guarding a kingdom that wasn't his. "I have a reservation," Marcus said calmly. His voice was low and measured. Ethan's smile widened. "I'm sure you think you do." A nervous laugh escaped from one corner of the room before quickly dying away. Marcus slipped a hand into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Not to argue. Not to prove anything. Just to check the time. 7:12 p.m. Exactly when his reservation was scheduled. Ethan shook his head. "Look, let's not make this awkward." But awkward had already arrived. It hung in the air between them like smoke. At a nearby table, Sophie Ramirez, a food blogger known for documenting Chicago's restaurant scene, slowly lowered her menu. Something about the exchange felt wrong. Marcus, meanwhile, remained completely composed. He stood with the patience of someone who had spent a lifetime watching people reveal themselves. Across the dining room, conversations faded one by one until the entire restaurant seemed balanced on a single moment. Ethan thought he was deciding who belonged inside Whitmore's steakhouse. What he didn't realize was that every person in that room was about to discover exactly who he was. Marcus Carter did not look like the man whose decisions moved billions of dollars across North America every year. That was partly because he never cared much about appearances and partly because he had learned long ago how quickly appearances could become a trap. Earlier that afternoon, his private jet had landed at Midway Airport after a series of meetings in Dallas. He had spent the flight reviewing shipping contracts, answering messages, and preparing for another week that would begin before sunrise. By the time he reached downtown Chicago, all he wanted was a quiet meal in 30 minutes without anyone asking for a signature, a photograph, or a decision. Whitmore's Steakhouse had always been that place. The restaurant sat tucked between historic buildings and overlooked a stretch of city lights that seemed to glow brighter after dark. Marcus had been coming there for nearly 15 years. Not every month, not every season, but often enough to know the menu, the staff turnover, and the owner himself. Yet none of that was visible tonight. There was no tailored suit announcing his success. No luxury watch catching the light. No driver waiting outside. Just a tall black man standing calmly near the entrance while a waiter decided who belonged. Across the room, Sophie Ramirez continued watching. Something about Marcus stood out. It was not wealth. It was composure. Most people would have left by now. Some would have argued. Others would have demanded a manager. Marcus did none of those things. He simply observed. The dining room reflected in his eyes like a mirror. The polished glasses. The candlelit tables. The customers pretending not to stare. He had spent decades studying people in conference rooms, boardrooms, airports, and hotels. One lesson never changed. Give someone a little authority, and eventually they would show you exactly who they were. Ethan seemed eager to prove the point. "Sir, I am trying to save you from an embarrassing situation," he said with a smile that never reached his eyes. "This restaurant has standards." The sentence drifted across the room. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Marcus looked at him for a moment. Not angry, not offended, just thoughtful. Ethan interpreted the silence as weakness. He had no idea he was standing in front of a man whose company employed more than 20,000 people. A man whose name appeared regularly on business magazine covers. A man who had spoken at universities, advised governors, and built an empire from a single delivery truck purchased when he was 23 years old. None of that mattered here. Not yet. Because the test was not about Marcus. It was about everyone else. The hostess behind the stand avoided eye contact. A bartender glanced over and quickly looked away. Several customers watched openly now. The atmosphere felt different. Charged. Waiting. Marcus slipped his phone back into his pocket and calmly looked toward the empty tables once more. Then he returned his attention to Ethan. The waiter still believed he controlled the evening. The truth was that he had already set something much larger in motion, and he did not even realize it. The tension that had started near the entrance was no longer confined to the host's stand. It spread across Whitmore's steakhouse table by table, conversation by conversation, until the entire dining room seemed connected by the same uneasy question. Why was this happening? Ethan appeared completely unaware of the shift. He stood straighter now, encouraged by the silence of those around him. In his mind, the matter was already settled. Marcus Carter did not belong here, and Ethan had decided that was enough. He gestured toward the front door. "Sir, I am trying to be polite. You are making this more difficult than it needs to be." Marcus remained exactly where he was. Calm. Unmoved. The steady confidence in his posture only seemed to irritate Ethan further. A couple entered the restaurant at that moment. Well-dressed. White. About the same age as Marcus. Before they could even reach the stand, Ethan's entire demeanor transformed. His smile appeared instantly. His shoulders relaxed. His voice warmed. "Good evening. Right this way." Several guests noticed it immediately. Ethan picked up 2 menus and guided the couple toward one of the empty tables Marcus had been looking at only moments earlier. The same empty tables Ethan had implied did not exist. The contradiction hung in the air like a spotlight. Marcus watched quietly. Sophie Ramirez watched too. So did a young hostess named Ava Collins standing several feet behind the reservation podium. Ava had worked at the restaurant for less than a year, but even she looked uncomfortable. Ethan returned a minute later, still carrying the confidence of someone who believed nobody would challenge him. Unfortunately for him, people were paying attention now. A businessman near the bar lowered his newspaper. A woman celebrating an anniversary leaned toward her husband and whispered something. The bartender stopped polishing glasses and glanced toward the entrance again. The room was no longer pretending not to notice. Ethan folded his arms. "I think it is time for you to leave." Marcus looked at him carefully. Not with anger. Not with frustration. More like someone studying a problem whose answer had already become obvious. "You seated them," Marcus said. His voice remained calm. Ethan shrugged. They had a reservation. Several nearby guests exchanged looks. The statement was so transparent that it almost sounded rehearsed. Marcus simply nodded once. The reaction seemed to frustrate Ethan even more. Most people argued when treated unfairly. Most people raised their voices. Marcus did neither. His composure turned every word Ethan spoke into evidence. Across the room, Sophie slowly reached for her phone. She was not recording yet. She was simply documenting details in her mind. The names. The faces. The timeline. Something about this evening felt important. Ava shifted uneasily behind the stand. She had checked the reservation system less than 30 minutes earlier. She remembered seeing Marcus Carter's reservation listed there. She remembered it clearly. The realization tightened her stomach. Around her, the atmosphere inside Whitmore's steakhouse continued changing. It no longer felt like a restaurant. It felt like a courtroom waiting for someone to finally tell the truth. And the longer Ethan talked, the more that truth seemed determined to reveal itself. Ava Collins stared at the reservation screen for several seconds before taking a slow breath. The cursor blinked beside a name she recognized immediately. Marcus Carter. The reservation had been there all evening. She remembered noticing it because the table assignment carried a special notation rarely used at the restaurant. She looked from the screen to Marcus, then back to Ethan. The longer she remained silent, the heavier the room seemed to become. Across the dining room, guests were no longer pretending to focus on their meals. Forks rested on plates. Conversations faded into whispers. The entire restaurant appeared suspended between two versions of the truth. Ethan noticed Ava looking at the monitor. "Everything all right?" he asked sharply. Ava hesitated. The question was simple. The answer was not. Before she could speak, Sophie Ramirez finally rose from her seat. The movement drew attention immediately. She stepped closer to the entrance and folded her arms. "Actually, I have a question," she said. Ethan turned toward her. "Ma'am, this does not concern you." Sophie shook her head. "It concerns everyone in this room." Several heads nodded. Ethan's confident expression flickered for the first time. Sophie pointed toward the dining area. "5 minutes ago you said there were no available tables." Her voice was calm but clear. "Then you seated another couple at one of the tables sitting empty right now." A quiet murmur rolled across the room. Ethan forced a smile. "There are details you are not aware of." Sophie did not move. "Then explain them." The question hung in the air. Ethan opened his mouth but no answer arrived. Near the bar, a businessman leaned back in his chair. A woman celebrating her anniversary exchanged glances with her husband. The atmosphere felt different now. Not angry. Not chaotic. Just awake. Marcus remained silent through all of it. His composure seemed almost impossible. He stood with the patience of someone who understood that people often revealed more when nobody interrupted them. Ava looked at him again. Then she looked at Ethan. Finally she spoke. "I saw the reservation." The room froze. Ethan turned so quickly that several nearby guests visibly reacted. "What did you say?" Ava swallowed. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice stayed steady. "I saw his reservation in the system." Silence spread through the restaurant like a wave. Sophie stared at Ava. Several guests leaned forward in their seats. Ethan laughed once, but it sounded forced. "You must be mistaken." Ava shook her head. "I am not." The words landed harder than anyone expected. Ethan's smile disappeared. For the first time all evening, uncertainty appeared in his eyes. Marcus watched quietly. Sophie glanced around the room and noticed something remarkable. People were beginning to choose sides. Not because they knew who Marcus was. Not because they knew anything about his success. They simply knew what they had witnessed. Ethan crossed his arms again, trying to regain control. "You are new here," he told Ava. "You probably misread something." Ava looked directly at him. "No, I did not." The dining room fell completely silent. In that moment, the evening stopped being about a reservation. It stopped being about a table. It became something much bigger. And everyone in Whitmore's steakhouse could feel it. The silence after Ava's words felt heavier than any argument. Ethan stood frozen for a second before forcing a laugh that sounded smaller than the room around him. "You are confused," he said. "That happens when you are new." But even he did not seem convinced. Ava lowered her eyes briefly, then looked back up. "I know what I saw." The reservation screen still glowed behind the podium. The truth was sitting there in plain sight. Impossible to argue away forever. Around the dining room, guests shifted in their seats. Some exchanged glances. Others watched Marcus Carter with growing curiosity. The strange thing was that Marcus still had not defended himself. He had not raised his voice. He had not demanded respect. He had not even mentioned who he was. He simply stood there while the evening revealed itself piece by piece. Ethan took a step closer. "Sir, I am asking you one last time to leave." The words were firm, but the confidence behind them was beginning to crack. Marcus looked at him calmly. Then something flickered across his face. Not anger. Not fear. Recognition. For a moment the restaurant disappeared. The polished wood walls faded. The soft music vanished. The city lights beyond the windows dissolved into memory. 17-year-old Marcus stood inside a roadside diner outside Montgomery, Alabama. He remembered the smell of coffee and grilled onions. He remembered saving money for weeks after school so he could take his younger cousin out for dinner. He remembered the waitress who looked at them, then pointed toward a corner table near the kitchen. Every other section had open seats. Every other customer seemed welcome. Yet somehow that table was where they belonged. Marcus remembered pretending not to notice. He remembered smiling so his cousin would not feel embarrassed. He remembered the ride home afterward, staring out the window while wondering why dignity seemed so easy for some people to give and so difficult for others to receive. The memory lasted only a few seconds. Then Whitmore's Steakhouse returned. Ethan was still standing there. The guests were still watching. The same lesson had simply changed locations. Marcus took a slow breath. Decades had passed since that diner. He had built companies, created opportunities, changed lives. Yet moments like this still appeared when least expected. Different faces. Same assumptions. Sophie noticed the change in his expression. Not pain exactly. More like someone carrying an old scar that never completely disappeared. Ava noticed it too. Suddenly this was no longer about a reservation. It was about something deeper. Ethan pointed toward the entrance again. "You are making everyone uncomfortable." Several guests immediately looked around in disbelief. Nobody seemed uncomfortable except Ethan himself. Marcus finally spoke. His voice remained steady and quiet. "Interesting." Ethan frowned. "What is interesting?" Marcus glanced around the room. The people deciding who belongs are usually the ones revealing the most about themselves. The words settled over the dining room. No shouting. No confrontation. Just truth delivered with calm precision. For the first time that evening, Ethan had no immediate response. And somewhere beyond the kitchen doors, unseen by everyone in the dining room, events were already beginning to move toward a conclusion none of them expected. The room remained perfectly still after Marcus spoke. The statement lingered over the dining room like a bell that had not finished ringing. Ethan looked around, searching for support. But the faces watching him were no longer neutral. Curiosity had replaced indifference. Doubt had replaced certainty. Even the customers who had stayed silent from the beginning now seemed to be questioning everything they had witnessed. Ethan straightened his shoulders and forced a laugh. That is a very dramatic thing to say for someone without a table. A few uneasy smiles appeared around the room, but they disappeared almost immediately. The joke landed nowhere. Marcus glanced at his watch. The movement was simple, almost casual, yet it seemed to irritate Ethan even more. "Are you checking how much time you have left before security arrives?" Ethan asked. Marcus looked back at him. "No." "Then what?" Marcus's expression never changed. "I am checking how long this has taken." Ethan frowned. "Taken for what?" Marcus reached into his pocket and removed his phone. The action instantly drew every eye in the room. Some guests assumed he was about to call corporate. Others thought he might finally contact a lawyer or demand a manager. Instead, he unlocked the screen and calmly selected a contact. Nothing about the moment felt dramatic. That was what made it powerful. Ethan smirked. "Calling someone to come save you?" Marcus ignored the comment. The line connected almost immediately. "Good evening, Marcus," a voice answered. Marcus spoke only one sentence. "Daniel, I think you need to come out." Then he ended the call. That was it. No explanation. No threats. No raised voice. Just 8 words. Ethan stared at him for a second before laughing openly. "That is your big move?" A few nervous chuckles came from the dining room. Sophie did not laugh. Ava did not laugh either. Something about Marcus's confidence felt too deliberate, too certain. He had made the call as though the outcome were already decided. Ethan folded his arms again. "Let me guess. Daniel is your friend." Marcus said nothing. "Or maybe your lawyer?" Still nothing. Ethan shook his head. "You know what I think? I think you finally realized you made a mistake coming here." Across the room, the bartender quietly stopped working and looked toward the kitchen entrance. Several guests followed his gaze. The atmosphere had changed again. It no longer felt tense. It felt expectant. Like a storm approaching from far away. Ava noticed movement behind the kitchen doors. Staff members were beginning to glance toward the back hallway. A server carrying a tray slowed down. Another employee stopped in mid-step. Whispers moved through the restaurant. Ethan remained unaware. He continued talking, filling the silence because silence no longer seemed to be on his side. Marcus simply waited. His calmness now felt almost impossible to ignore. Every second that passed seemed to strengthen it. Sophie looked toward the kitchen entrance once more. Whatever was about to happen, she could feel it coming. And somewhere beyond those doors, someone had already started walking toward the dining room. The kitchen door swung open without warning. The sound was small, yet it cut through the restaurant more effectively than any raised voice could have. Conversations stopped. Glasses paused halfway to tables. Even the staff seemed to freeze. A man in his early 60s stepped into the dining room wearing a dark chef coat beneath a tailored jacket. His silver hair was neatly combed back. His presence carried the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades building a reputation that filled every seat in the room. Daniel Whitmore looked toward the entrance and immediately spotted Marcus. For a brief second, genuine surprise crossed his face. Then came recognition. Then something else. Warmth. Without hesitation, Daniel walked straight across the dining room. Not toward Ethan. Not toward the reservation stand. Toward Marcus. The distance between them seemed to stretch forever. Every eye in the restaurant followed him. Ethan's confident smile slowly faded. He glanced between Daniel and Marcus as though trying to solve a puzzle that suddenly made no sense. Daniel reached Marcus and stopped. The room held its breath. Then the restaurant owner extended his hand. "Marcus Carter," he said with a broad smile. "You should have told me you were coming tonight." A silence deeper than any before settled across the restaurant. Marcus shook his hand. "I had a reservation." Several guests exchanged stunned looks. Sophie lowered her phone slightly, hardly believing what she was witnessing. Ava's eyes widened. The businessman near the bar leaned forward in his chair. Ethan looked as though the floor beneath him had shifted. Daniel laughed lightly. "You always have a reservation." Then he glanced around the room and noticed the expressions on the faces of both customers and staff. His smile faded. Years of experience told him immediately that something was wrong. "What happened?" he asked. Nobody answered right away. Ethan opened his mouth but no words emerged. Sophie finally stepped forward. "A lot happened." Daniel turned toward her. The restaurant owner listened as she briefly described what everyone had witnessed. The refusal. The comments. The empty tables. The reservation. Ava quietly confirmed every detail. With each sentence, Daniel's expression grew more serious. Ethan tried to interrupt twice, but the words sounded weaker each time. Marcus remained calm. He did not add anything. He did not need to. The facts were speaking clearly enough on their own. Daniel slowly looked at Ethan. The disappointment in his eyes seemed heavier than anger. "You refused to seat him?" Ethan swallowed. "I thought." Daniel raised a hand. "No." The single word stopped him immediately. Daniel looked back at Marcus. "My friend, I owe you an apology." The dining room fell silent once again. Not because of who Marcus was, but because everyone suddenly understood the truth. The man they had watched being judged, questioned, and dismissed was not a stranger trying to get into the restaurant. He was someone the owner knew personally. Someone respected. Someone welcome. And the realization hit Ethan harder than any argument ever could. Daniel Whitmore's apology lingered in the air long after he finished speaking. Nobody moved. Nobody seemed willing to break the moment. Ethan stood near the reservation stand staring at the floor, his confidence draining away one realization at a time. The restaurant owner looked around the dining room, taking in the faces of guests, employees, and witnesses. Then his attention returned to Ethan. "Tell me why," Daniel said quietly. The question carried more weight than a shout ever could. Ethan swallowed hard. "I was trying to protect the restaurant." Daniel nodded slowly. "From what?" Ethan searched for an answer. "I thought he did not fit the type of customer we usually have." Several guests exchanged glances. The words sounded even worse once spoken aloud. Daniel folded his arms. "And what type is that?" Ethan hesitated. The silence stretched. Every second seemed to pull the truth closer to the surface. Sophie watched carefully. Ava stood motionless behind the podium. Marcus remained calm, his expression unchanged. Ethan finally looked up. I just made a judgment call. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. Exactly. The single word landed with precision. Ethan looked confused. Daniel continued. You made a judgment before you had facts. You decided who belonged before you knew anything about the person standing in front of you. The restaurant remained silent. Even the kitchen staff had gathered near the doorway. Nobody wanted to miss what happened next. Daniel took a slow breath. This business survives because people trust us to treat them with dignity. Every guest. Every time. He glanced toward Marcus. That standard does not change based on clothing, assumptions, or personal opinions. Ethan lowered his eyes again. The room seemed smaller around him now. The authority he had carried earlier had completely disappeared. Daniel looked toward Ava. Did he have a reservation? Yes, Ava answered immediately. I saw it myself. Daniel nodded. Then he turned toward Sophie. Did you hear the comments that were made? Sophie met his gaze. Every one of them. Daniel looked back at Ethan. There was no anger in his expression anymore. Only disappointment. Somehow that felt heavier. You were given responsibility, Daniel said. You used it to decide who deserved respect. The words settled over the room. Several guests quietly nodded. The lesson had become obvious to everyone. Ethan opened his mouth as if searching for an explanation, but none came. Daniel finally made his decision. You will not be working here anymore. No dramatic outburst followed. No argument. No confrontation. Just silence. The kind of silence that appears when consequences arrive. Across the dining room, a few guests began to clap. Then others joined. Not because someone had lost a job. Not because they wanted punishment. They were applauding accountability. They were applauding the simple idea that fairness still mattered. Marcus watched quietly as the sound spread through the restaurant. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. Because from the beginning, this evening had never been about winning. It had been about revealing what was already there. The applause gradually faded, leaving behind a calm that had been missing from the restaurant all evening. The tension that once filled the room had dissolved, replaced by something quieter and far more powerful. Daniel Whitmore turned toward Marcus. Your table is ready, he said. Dinner is on me. A few guests smiled. Others nodded in agreement. Seemed like the perfect ending. But Marcus looked around the dining room before gently shaking his head. Thank you, Daniel. But I think I am going to pass tonight. The answer surprised everyone. Daniel frowned slightly. Are you sure? Marcus smiled. Not a triumphant smile. Not the smile of someone who had one. Just the smile of someone who understood the difference between being respected and being recognized. I did not come here for a free meal, he said. And I did not stay because I wanted special treatment. The room fell quiet once more. Every eye remained fixed on him. Even the employees standing near the kitchen entrance seemed unwilling to miss a single word. Marcus looked around the restaurant slowly. The chandelier still glowed above the tables. The city lights still shimmered through the windows. The same room that had felt cold less than an hour earlier now felt entirely different. The truth is, Marcus continued, none of this was ever about me. Several people exchanged puzzled looks. Sophie listened carefully. Ava did too. Marcus glanced toward the entrance where the evening had begun. The real question was how someone would be treated when nobody thought they were important. The words settled over the dining room. Nobody interrupted. Nobody looked away. Marcus continued. Character is not revealed when you meet powerful people. Character is revealed when you think someone has no power at all. The statement landed with the force of absolute truth. Daniel lowered his eyes briefly. Ava nodded. Sophie felt a chill run through her shoulders. Around the room, guests sat quietly, reflecting on everything they had witnessed. Marcus reached into his pocket, removed a business card and handed it to Ava. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw the name. Thank you for speaking up, he said. That matters more than you know. Ava accepted the card carefully, as if holding something far more valuable than paper. Marcus then shook Daniel's hand. Take care of this place. Daniel nodded. I will. Without another word, Marcus turned and walked toward the front door. Nobody stopped him. Nobody needed to. The dining room watched as he stepped into the Chicago night and disappeared beyond the glass entrance. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then Sophie quietly lowered her phone and smiled. The story people would remember was not about a billionaire. It was not about a restaurant owner. It was not even about a reservation. It was about dignity, about assumptions, about the cost of judging someone before learning their story. And as the lights of the city reflected against the restaurant windows, one lesson remained behind long after Marcus Carter was gone. Respect should never depend on appearances, because the people we underestimate often reveal the most about ourselves.